The moment my older brother told me I should hand over my grandfather's house because kids need it more, I knew Easter dinner was about to turn into a disaster. What I didn't know was that this argument had been building behind my back for months. For context, I'm 33, single, and own a small architectural design company on the coast of Massachusetts. My life is pretty quiet. Most weekdays are spent managing projects and meeting clients. Most weekends are spent working on an old oceanfront cottage that my grandfather left me when he passed away. That cottage matters more than I can explain. It isn't worth millions. It isn't some luxury vacation property. But it holds every good memory I have of my grandfather. Every creaky floorboard, every weathered window, every room reminds me of summers spent learning how to build things with my hands while he told stories from his younger years. I've poured years of work into restoring it, and apparently that made it a target. Easter brunch was at my parents' house, a large colonial-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The place always looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfect lawn, perfect flowers, perfect furniture. That was important to my mother. My mom, Diane, has always cared deeply about appearances. She loves the image of a successful, close-knit family. If you looked at her social media, you'd think we all spent every weekend laughing together over homemade pies and family game nights. Reality was a little different. My father, Walter, was quieter. He rarely took sides openly, but he had a habit of supporting whoever made life easiest for him. Then there was my brother, Eric. Eric is 36 and has somehow turned being a father into his entire identity. Don't get me wrong. His 3 kids are great. I genuinely love my nieces and nephew. But Eric treats parenthood like a status symbol. Every conversation eventually circles back to how difficult his life is, how much responsibility he carries, and how people without children couldn't possibly understand real sacrifice. His wife, Melissa, encourages it. Together they project this picture-perfect family image. Matching holiday photos, coordinated outfits, endless social media posts about blessings and gratitude. Meanwhile, I've quietly helped them out more times than I can count. When one of Eric's business ventures failed, I loaned him money. When they needed emergency childcare, I stepped in. When they wanted weekend getaways, I watched the kids without complaint. I never kept score because that's what family does. At least that's what I believed. Looking back, maybe that was my first mistake. I arrived about 20 minutes late that morning after getting stuck in holiday traffic. For a second I considered turning around and going home. I wish I had. The front door opened before I even knocked twice. Eric stood there grinning. "Well, look who finally made it," he said. "Traffic was awful." He laughed. "Try loading 3 kids into a car. Traffic's the easy part." I forced a smile and stepped inside. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls, baked ham, and fresh coffee. My mother appeared from the kitchen wearing one of her favorite spring aprons. "There you are," she said, kissing my cheek. "I was starting to think you weren't coming." "I live 20 minutes away, Mom." She laughed anyway and guided me toward the dining room. Everyone was already seated. My father sat at the head of the table, reading glasses balanced on the edge of his nose as he looked over something on his tablet. The kids were arguing over chocolate eggs. Melissa was arranging plates. And Eric was still smiling. At the time, I thought he was just in a good mood. Later, I realized he already knew exactly how the afternoon was going to unfold. My sister-in-law, Melissa, was setting down a pitcher of orange juice while the kids folded and unfolded their cloth napkins like it was some kind of competition. I slid into the empty chair across from Eric. "Wow," I said, glancing at the nearly empty mimosa beside him. "You guys couldn't wait 5 more minutes?" "We had to stick to the kids' schedule," Melissa said with a patient smile. "Today's the twins' nap day." I nodded like I understood what that meant. The next 20 minutes were completely normal. At least on the surface. The conversation bounced between school projects, soccer practice, and neighborhood gossip. My mom casually worked her favorite topic into the discussion. "So," she said, trying to sound subtle, "are you seeing anyone these days?" I almost laughed. "Work's been busy." That answer satisfied nobody, but it ended the conversation. As everyone talked, I kept catching Eric looking at me. Not casually. Not the way someone glances around a room. He kept studying me. Waiting. Like he was rehearsing something in his head. I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it. That was my second mistake. Eventually the plates were cleared away and dessert was brought out. That's when Eric stood up. He raised his glass and tapped it with a spoon. "Before we eat," he announced, "I just want to say something." The room quieted. "I've been thinking lately about how lucky I am. About family. About everything we've built." My mother immediately smiled. She loves speeches. "Especially my brother," Eric continued, turning toward me. "We don't always say it, but he's helped us a lot over the years." I froze. The compliment felt strange coming from him. Not impossible. Just unusual. "You've always shown up when we needed you," he said. "And I appreciate that." Thanks," I replied. He grinned. Then everything changed. "Actually, that brings me to something I wanted to discuss." The second he said that, a knot formed in my stomach. I didn't know why yet. But I knew I wasn't going to like it. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," Eric continued. "About creating something lasting for the kids." Mom nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, absolutely." And Melissa and I came up with an idea. He reached over and squeezed her hand. She smiled back. Way too confidently. The room felt different suddenly. Like everyone except me already knew where this conversation was headed. "We think the beach cottage should stay with the next generation." I blinked. "What?" The cottage, Eric repeated. We think it should go to us. For a second I genuinely thought he was joking. I laughed. Nobody else did. Wait, I said. You mean visit it more? No. His smile never moved. I mean live there. The room went silent. You're serious? Of course. Melissa jumped in before I could say anything else. It would be perfect for the kids. Perfect, Eric agreed. You're hardly there half the year anyway. You're busy working, traveling, doing your own thing. I stared at him. You mean my job? You know what I mean. No. I knew exactly what he meant. And somehow it was worse. You have 3 children, he continued. They deserve a place like that. And because of that, I should give you my house? It's not just a house. The confidence in his voice made my skin crawl. It's family property. No, I said. It's my property. The smile finally slipped from his face. Melissa's expression hardened too. Eric leaned forward. You don't even have a family. There it was. The real argument. Not finances. Not practicality. Not the children. The fact that I was single. The fact that I didn't live the life they thought I should. I felt my jaw tighten. My grandfather left that place to me. Because he trusted you, Eric said quickly. But he wanted it to stay with family. I am family. You know what I mean. I did. And I hated it. He pointed toward the kids. They're the future. The implication hung in the air. And what are you? A placeholder? A caretaker? A temporary owner? I took a slow breath. Then another. No. The room froze. Eric blinked. No. No, I repeated calmly. I'm not giving you the cottage. His face darkened immediately. Why? The entitlement in that single word was unbelievable. Because it belongs to me. That's not a reason. It's literally the only reason I need. I could feel my heartbeat speeding up. Grandpa left it to me. I've spent years restoring it. I pay the taxes. I handle the repairs. I maintain every inch of that property. And I'm keeping it. The silence became uncomfortable. Then Eric slammed his palm against the table. The kids jumped. My mother gasped. You're unbelievably selfish. There it was. The accusation I knew was coming. You have no idea what real responsibility looks like, he snapped. You live alone. You answer to nobody. I stood slowly. Having children doesn't give you ownership of things that belong to other people. You think you're better than me? No. I looked him directly in the eye. But I think expecting someone to hand over their inheritance because you decided to have kids is insane. Melissa immediately pushed back her chair. You don't have to be so cruel. Cruel? I said. I actually laughed. You want to talk about cruel? Try spending years being treated like you matter less because you didn't follow the exact life script everyone else wanted for you. The room went still. Eric pushed back his chair so hard it scraped across the hardwood floor. Then he stood. You have no idea what you're talking about. Really? I wasn't yelling. That seemed to make him even angrier. You've spent years acting like I'm somehow incomplete because I'm not married with 3 kids. That's not what this is about. Yes, it is. For the first time all afternoon, nobody interrupted me. Not my mother. Not Melissa. Nobody. You don't want the cottage because it's best for your kids. You want it because you've convinced yourself that anything I have should eventually become yours. Eric's face turned red. Then, in one angry motion, he swept his arm across the table. A glass hit the floor. It shattered instantly. The sharp crack echoed through the dining room. The kids started crying. My mother jumped. Melissa rushed toward the children. And finally my father stood up. Enough. His voice cut through the room like a knife. Everyone froze, including Eric. Dad pointed directly at him. His hand was shaking. Not with fear. With frustration. You have got to stop this. Eric stared at him. What? You heard me. The room felt frozen in place. My father almost never raised his voice. I could count on one hand how many times I'd seen it happen. You've spent your entire life demanding things you didn't earn, Dad said. And every time someone tells you no, you act like you're the victim. Dad. No. Eric stopped talking. You think being a father makes you entitled to whatever you want. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. For a moment, nobody moved. Even my mother looked stunned. Dad rarely challenged Eric. When he did, it usually happened privately. Never like this. Never in front of everyone. You're acting like a child, he continued. And right now you're embarrassing yourself. The silence afterward felt endless. I could see the shock on Eric's face. He genuinely hadn't expected anyone to push back. Especially not Dad. That was when I pulled out my phone. Eric noticed immediately. What are you doing? Making a call. To who? I unlocked the screen. My attorney. The room went quiet again. What? I think it's time I reviewed a few things. His expression shifted. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. For what? He asked. I looked directly at him. Because there's something you clearly don't know. Then I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't yell. I simply left. 30 minutes later, I was sitting alone in my truck parked outside my parents' neighborhood. The call with my attorney had already happened. Now a PDF sat open on my phone. A document I hadn't looked at in years. A document my grandfather made sure existed before he died. And buried inside it was a clause that could change everything. One sentence. One signature. One legal protection nobody else in my family seemed aware of. I stared at it for several minutes. Part of me wanted to send it immediately. Part of me wanted to burn every bridge and be done with all of them. But another part of me hesitated. Maybe because despite everything they were still my family. Or maybe because I knew once that information came out, there would be no going back. I closed the file. Not yet. They hadn't earned that lesson. At least not yet. Looking back, I don't know why I kept expecting things to be different. For years I'd occupied this strange position in my family. I wasn't the oldest child. I wasn't married. I didn't have children. And somehow those facts always seemed to put me one step lower in everyone's priorities. When Eric needed money, I was family. When he needed childcare, I was family. When he wanted my property, suddenly I was standing in the way of what family deserved. The hypocrisy would have been funny if it wasn't so exhausting. I sat there another 10 minutes. No calls. No texts. No apologies. Nothing. Eventually I started the engine and drove away. Not home. To the cottage. The drive along the coastline helped clear my head. By the time the ocean came into view, some of the anger had faded. As soon as I pulled into the gravel driveway, I felt my shoulders relax. The cottage sat exactly where it always had. Weathered cedar siding. Wraparound porch. The same view of the water my grandfather had loved. For the first time all day I could breathe. This place was never just real estate. It was memories. Saturday mornings making pancakes. Learning how to replace shingles. Listening to my grandfather tell stories while we worked on projects together. Every room held a piece of him. Every repair I'd made over the years felt like keeping part of him alive. And that was something Eric never understood. To him it was property. To me it was history. I stayed there the entire weekend. Ignored calls. Ignored emails. Ignored everyone. I needed distance. What I didn't realize was that while I was gone, the family narrative was already being rewritten. And according to everyone else, I was apparently the villain. When I finally turned my phone back on Monday morning, the screen exploded with notifications. 32 missed messages. A dozen texts from Eric. Multiple voicemails. Messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. Even an email from my mother. The subject line read, "We need to talk." I opened Eric's first voicemail. "Nathan, seriously? What was that?" His voice was already irritated. "You embarrassed me in front of my kids over a stupid house." Pause. Then. "You don't even use it that much." The next voicemail was worse. "Look, maybe I got heated, but you're blowing this way out of proportion. Call me back so we can fix this." Fix this? Like I was the problem. Then came my mother's message. "Honey, your brother told me what happened. I think you're being overly emotional about all of this. We need to discuss a reasonable solution." A reasonable solution. Those two words immediately set off alarm bells in my head. Because whenever my family talked about a reasonable solution, it usually meant one thing. They had already decided what should happen. And they expected me to agree. Apparently, standing up for myself was now being classified as a tantrum. That realization should have upset me. Instead, it just made me tired. I ignored the messages. For one evening at least. Then around 8 o'clock that night, someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and immediately groaned. Eric. Of course. He was wearing that familiar smile. The one he always used when he wanted something but wanted to pretend he didn't. I opened the door halfway. "What?" "Well, straight to business." "What do you need?" He chuckled. "Can I come in?" "Why?" "Because we're brothers." I almost closed the door. Instead I stepped aside. Partly because I didn't want him causing a scene in the hallway. Partly because some stupid part of me still hoped he might actually be there to apologize. That hope lasted about 30 seconds. The moment he walked inside, his eyes started moving around the apartment. The furniture. The walls. The layout. Everything. It felt less like a visit and more like an inspection. My apartment wasn't fancy. But I liked it. Clean lines. Minimal clutter. Comfortable furniture. A space that actually reflected me. Eric looked around like he was evaluating a hotel room. Then he sat down. "You know," he said casually, "this whole thing probably would have gone a lot smoother if you hadn't stormed out." I stared at him. "Stormed out?" "Yeah. You demanded my property." "See," he said, pointing at me. "This is what I mean." I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. "You literally asked me to give you my grandfather's cottage. You make it sound insane." "Because it is." He leaned back and folded his arms. "Nathan, you've always been emotional." There it was again. The family favorite. Whenever they couldn't win an argument, suddenly I was being emotional. "You've always been entitled." That one actually caught me off guard. "Entitled?" "Yeah." I blinked. Then I started counting. "The house down payment mom and dad gave you?" His jaw tightened. "The 6 months of rent I covered when your business failed?" "Nate. The credit card debt they helped pay off?" "That was years ago." "Exactly." I leaned forward. "And somehow I never got any of that money back." His expression darkened. "That's not the point." "No, actually, I think it is." Eric shook his head. "No. The point is that the cottage makes more sense for my family." There was that word again. Sense. As if ownership was just a suggestion. "You don't need it." I stared at him. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." "No." I shook my head. "You want it." His face hardened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that still sticks with me months later. "You're going to die alone there." The room went silent. He said it so casually. like he was commenting on the weather. Not trying to weaponize every insecurity he'd ever imagined I had. You'll be sitting in that cottage by yourself one day, he continued. And for what? I stood up immediately. Leave. He rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. Get out. Nate. Now. For the first time all night, he realized I wasn't going to engage anymore. He stood slowly, walked toward the door, then stopped. You're going to regret this. And just like that, he left. The apartment felt lighter the second the door shut behind him. But things didn't improve. If anything, they got worse. Over the next several days, the pressure campaign intensified. My mother texted constantly. You should be the bigger person. Think about the children. Your brother is under a lot of stress right now. Families compromise. Every message said the same thing in different words. Give Eric what he wants. Nobody ever asked what I wanted. Nobody ever asked why I felt hurt. The assumption was that my role was to sacrifice. The realization stung more than I expected. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't really about the cottage anymore. It was about boundaries. And my family hated boundaries. Then something happened that changed everything. 3 days later, I got a call from an old college friend. Mark worked in real estate. We'd stayed in touch over the years, mostly exchanging holiday messages and occasional favors. His voice sounded strange. Careful. Nate, can I ask you something? Sure. Did you put the cottage on the market? I frowned. What? The beach cottage? No. Pause. Then. Are you sure? My stomach tightened. Yes. Another pause. Okay. The hesitation in his voice made my pulse spike. Mark. Yeah. What happened? He exhaled. Someone contacted our office. Every instinct in my body suddenly went on high alert. Who? They claimed they had authority to discuss the property. I sat up straighter. What kind of authority? Power of attorney. The room seemed to shrink. What? We didn't move forward, he quickly added. The paperwork looked wrong. The signatures didn't match. There were too many inconsistencies. I couldn't speak for a second. My heart was pounding. Who submitted it? Mark hesitated. Then he said the name. Eric. I closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked. Because I wasn't. Somewhere deep down, I'd already known he was capable of it. Are you still there? Mark asked. Yeah. My voice sounded distant. Can you send me everything? Already did. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat in silence, trying to process what I'd just heard. The argument at Easter had been bad. The manipulation afterward had been worse. But this crossed into entirely different territory. This wasn't entitlement anymore. This was an attempt to gain control of property that didn't belong to him. And suddenly that trust document sitting on my phone felt a lot more important. I called my attorney immediately. Not as a threat. Not as a bluff. For protection. I want everything documented, I told her. Every text. Every voicemail. Every contact attempt. Understood. I want the ownership records reviewed. Okay. And I want to make sure nobody can claim authority over that property. There was a brief pause. Then she spoke. You may want to prepare for what's going to happen when the trust provisions become public. I looked toward the window. The sun was setting outside. Orange light filling the room. For the first time since Easter, I felt completely calm. Good, I said. I think it's time everyone finally learned what Grandpa actually planned. We can secure everything immediately, my attorney said. The question is whether you want to pursue legal action. I stared out the window for a moment. Not yet. Not yet. Not until I know exactly how far he's willing to go. She didn't argue. Keep documenting everything, she said. Every message. Every call. Every interaction. After we hung up, I sat in silence. Part of me wanted to report Eric right then and there. Another part wanted to believe there was still some line he wouldn't cross. I wasn't sure which part of me was being naive. The next afternoon, I got a text from my father. 5 words. Come over. We need to talk. No emojis. No explanation. Just that. My father wasn't the type to send mysterious messages. In fact, he barely texted at all. So I drove over. When I arrived, he was sitting in his study. The room looked exactly the same as it had my entire life. Dark wood paneling. Old bookshelves. A dusty globe in the corner that nobody had touched in years. The air smelled faintly of leather and scotch. Dad motioned toward a chair. Sit. I did. He poured 2 glasses without saying a word and handed one to me. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he finally broke the silence. I heard what your brother tried to do. I looked up. How? A faint smile crossed his face. Nathan, I've been around a long time. I waited. And contrary to popular belief, I do occasionally pay attention. That actually made me laugh. A little. His expression quickly turned serious again. I'm tired. The words caught me off guard. Tired? Of this. He gestured vaguely. The favoritism. The excuses. The constant expectation that everyone should rearrange their lives to accommodate your brother. I didn't know what to say. My father wasn't exactly known for emotional speeches. You've spent years helping this family, he continued. Financially. Emotionally. Practically. He took a sip. And somehow you've become the one everyone expects to sacrifice. I stared at him. Hearing that felt strange. Almost uncomfortable. Not because I disagreed. Because I'd never heard him say it out loud before. Your mother sees parenthood as the highest achievement a person can have, he said carefully. She always has. I knew that already. I'd spent years living it. But you've built something too. He looked directly at me. A good life. The words hit harder than they probably should have. For a second I couldn't respond. Then Dad said something that completely changed the conversation. I got a call from your grandfather's attorney. My head snapped up. What? A few days ago. I frowned. Why would he call you? Dad swirled the glass in his hand. Because apparently your grandfather anticipated something like this. The room suddenly felt very quiet. What do you mean? The trust. I sat up straighter. Dad nodded. He wanted to make sure everyone understood exactly how protected that property is. My stomach tightened. You knew about the clause? Not until recently. That surprised me. What clause? He asked. I studied him for a second. Then realized he genuinely wanted me to explain. So I did. The ownership protections. The restrictions. The provisions preventing anyone from claiming an interest in the cottage without my direct authorization. When I finished, Dad nodded slowly. Smart man. Grandpa. Very. A small smile appeared on his face. He always understood people better than most of us. I looked down at my glass. A question had been bothering me ever since discovering the documents. Why didn't he tell me? Dad didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was quiet. Because he trusted you. I looked up. He knew you'd never abuse that power. Something shifted inside me at that moment. For weeks I'd been angry, hurt, frustrated, focused entirely on the betrayal. But hearing that reminded me of something important. My grandfather had known me, really known me. He'd seen who I was. And he'd planned accordingly. Even after he was gone. The realization stayed with me long after I left my parents' house. But there was another detail Dad didn't know. A detail almost nobody knew. Because the cottage wasn't protected by just one trust. There was another one. A separate arrangement my grandfather had established years earlier. One I'd barely thought about until recently. And unlike the first trust, this one wasn't centered around the property itself. It involved assets, investments, money. A lot more money than most people realized. The value had quietly grown for years. And buried inside those documents was a provision of its own. One that could completely change the situation. One that would make Eric's obsession with the cottage look very short-sighted. I didn't tell Dad. Not yet. I wasn't even sure what I was going to do with the information. All I knew was that things were getting bigger. And messier. For the first time in weeks I slept. Not well. Not peacefully. But better. I wasn't waking up every hour replaying arguments in my head. I wasn't imagining conversations that hadn't happened. I wasn't rehearsing speeches for people who weren't listening. The anger was still there. But it felt more controlled. More focused. The next morning I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while sunlight slowly crept through the blinds. My family had crossed a line. That much was undeniable now. Eric hadn't simply asked for the cottage. He had attempted to position himself as someone with authority over property that wasn't his. And somehow I was still being treated like the unreasonable one. What bothered me even more was my mother's silence. Not once had she asked whether the allegations were true. Not once had she expressed concern about what Eric had done. Instead, she kept returning to the same argument. Family. Compromise. The children. As though those words erased everything else. At least Eric was honest about what he wanted. Mom hid behind diplomacy. Which somehow felt worse. The pressure continued. The messages continued. But I stopped reacting. No arguments. No angry texts. No dramatic confrontations. Instead I started preparing. Quietly. Methodically. One step at a time. A few days later, I contacted the law office that had handled my grandfather's estate. The original attorney had retired years earlier. His son now managed the practice. I asked if we could meet in person. There was something I needed to understand. Something about that second trust. And based on the pause before he answered, I had a feeling the conversation was about to reveal far more than I expected. A week later, I met with the attorney who had taken over my grandfather's estate work. His office had changed. He had changed. The last time I'd seen him, he was a middle-aged lawyer buried under stacks of paperwork. Now his hair was completely gray and he moved a little slower. His eyes, however, were exactly the same. Sure. Observant. The kind of eyes that noticed things people thought they were hiding. We met at a small cafe near the harbor instead of his office. After a few minutes of small talk, I got straight to the point. There's something I need to ask about. He nodded. The second trust? I blinked. You already know why I'm here? A faint smile appeared. I suspected. I leaned forward. Why was it created? The smile widened slightly. For some reason he looked pleased that I was asking. Because your grandfather planned for possibilities. That sounds vague. It was meant to be. He folded his hands together. Then he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Has anyone else contacted you about it? Who would? Your brother. I shook my head. He doesn't even know it exists. Exactly. The attorney nodded as if I'd confirmed something important. Then he lowered his voice. That was intentional. For a moment I just stared at him. What was? The entire structure. He took a sip of coffee. Your grandfather wanted certain assets separated from public records as much as legally possible. Why? Because he understood families. I couldn't argue with that. The attorney pulled a folder from his briefcase. It was much thicker than I expected. Most people assume the cottage is the valuable asset. It isn't. He laughed quietly. Oh, it is. Then he opened the file. And suddenly I understood. The cottage sat on prime coastal land. Land that had become dramatically more valuable over the years. Development restrictions had changed. Property values had exploded. Tourism had increased. The entire area had transformed while most people weren't paying attention. Including me. I knew the cottage had appreciated. I had no idea by how much. Then he showed me something else. Several adjoining parcels. A strip of undeveloped land stretching behind the property. Access rights. Usage rights. Long-term protections. All connected to a separate trust. One that wasn't publicly tied to my name. One that had quietly grown in value for years. I sat there staring at the documents, trying to process the numbers. This can't be right. It is. The attorney tapped one page. Your grandfather anticipated future disputes over the property. Disputes? He believed success often creates entitlement. The words hit harder than they should have. Because they perfectly described what was happening. So what happens now? The attorney studied me carefully. That depends. On what? Whether you decide to activate the trust provisions. I frowned. What would trigger that? He slid another document across the table. I read it twice, then a third time. And suddenly my pulse sped up. Because Eric had already triggered it. Without realizing it. His attempt to establish authority over the cottage. His fraudulent paperwork. His efforts to interfere with ownership. Every single one of those actions mattered. Legally. Significantly. I looked up. You're serious? Completely. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since Easter. Clarity. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. My grandfather hadn't simply left me a cottage. He'd left me protection. A roadmap. A contingency plan. One designed specifically for situations like this. I left the cafe carrying copies of documents that changed the entire landscape of the conflict. The irony wasn't lost on me. Eric thought he was playing offense. He didn't realize the game had been over before he ever started. Unfortunately, legal protection didn't stop the family fallout. That part arrived anyway. And it arrived slowly. At first it was subtle. I stopped getting invited to family dinners. Nobody added me to group chats anymore. Birthdays came and went without calls. Weekend gatherings happened without anyone mentioning them. It was like being erased one small piece at a time. Then things escalated. One afternoon my aunt called. The moment I answered, I could hear hesitation in her voice. Nathan. Hey Aunt Linda. Can I ask you something? Sure. Pause. Then. Did you really throw Eric's children out of the cottage? I almost dropped the phone. What? She sounded uncomfortable. Your mother said there was some incident. What incident? She said you told the kids they weren't welcome anymore. I sat down slowly. Because suddenly everything made sense. That's not true. Another pause. She also said you called them burdens. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. I've never said anything remotely close to that. Silence. Then a long sigh. That's what I thought. I rubbed my forehead. When was this supposed to have happened? According to your mother? Yeah. Several weeks ago. I closed my eyes. I hadn't even seen the kids since Easter. The story didn't make any sense. And that was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was narrative management. Someone was actively rewriting events. And they were doing it intentionally. Over the next several days, more examples surfaced. Relatives started treating me differently. Conversations became awkward. People seemed sympathetic in a way I couldn't understand. Until another message arrived. This time from an old family friend. A retired pastor who had known my grandparents for decades. His email was polite, kind, well-intentioned, but it made my stomach drop. He wrote that he was sorry for everything happening between me and my brother. He hoped I could find healing. He hoped I could work through whatever resentment I was carrying. Whatever resentment I was carrying. I read that sentence 3 times. Someone had painted a very specific picture. A lonely man. A bitter son. A jealous brother. A person clinging to property because he had nothing else. And the worst part? People were believing it. Not because it was true. Because it fit the story they already wanted to tell. The successful family man versus the isolated bachelor. The father versus the selfish brother. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Eric wasn't just trying to take the cottage anymore. He was trying to take credibility. And if I wasn't careful, he might succeed. What he didn't know was that every lie, every phone call, every attempt to manipulate people was creating exactly the paper trail my attorney had warned me about. And sooner or later, all of it was going to matter. I wish I could say the lies stopped bothering me. They didn't. For a while, they got to me more than I wanted to admit. The stories being spread around the family weren't just annoying. They were effective. Everywhere I turned, it felt like people had already decided who the villain was. And it wasn't Eric. It was me. The selfish brother. The bitter bachelor. The guy hoarding a family property because he couldn't stand seeing someone else happy. Logically, I knew it was nonsense. Emotionally? That was harder. I started losing focus. Canceled meetings. Pushed deadlines. Ignored calls from clients. Every time I sat down to work, my mind drifted back to the same questions. How long had this been happening? How many people believed it? How many family gatherings had turned into conversations about me after I left the room? The worst part wasn't the lies. It was realizing how easily people accepted them. Because betrayal hurts differently when it comes from people whose approval you're still trying to earn. Even when you know you shouldn't. For a couple of weeks, I was stuck in that headspace. Angry, distracted, exhausted. Then one night I grabbed my keys and drove to the cottage. No plan. No destination beyond that. Just an overwhelming need to get away. It was nearly midnight when I arrived. The property was quiet. The ocean beyond it was almost black. The only sounds were waves and wind. I poured coffee into a travel mug and sat on the back porch. For the first time in weeks, my brain finally slowed down. I sat there remembering my grandfather. Not the estate. Not the trust. Not the legal mess. Just him. I remembered repainting the porch railing together one summer. Both of us somehow managing to get more paint on ourselves than on the wood. I remembered replacing broken tiles in the kitchen. Repairing shutters. Fixing wiring. Countless weekends spent learning skills I never expected to use later in life. He always talked about ownership differently than most people. To him, ownership wasn't about possession. It was about responsibility. Taking care of something. Protecting it. Leaving it better than you found it. The memory stayed with me long after the coffee was gone. And sometime before sunrise, I made a decision. I was done reacting. From that point forward, I was going to build. Quietly. Methodically. Without asking anyone's permission. The next several weeks became some of the most productive of my life. I threw myself back into work. New projects. New clients. New opportunities. At the same time, I started strengthening every legal protection surrounding the cottage. The trusts were formally secured. Additional documentation was filed. Every loose end was tied off. Then I began making improvements. Real improvements. Not cosmetic ones. Permanent ones. I hired specialists to help create a coastal preservation plan for the property. Environmental protections. Land conservation measures. Long-term usage restrictions. The kind of changes that would preserve the area for decades. I upgraded the security system. Installed new cameras. Remote access controls. Backup monitoring. Everything. If someone stepped onto the property, I'd know. I also partnered with a local educational nonprofit. The idea came from an old conversation I'd had with my grandfather years earlier. Every summer, the cottage would host small environmental education programs for students. Marine biology workshops. Coastal conservation projects. Hands-on learning experiences. The kind of thing Grandpa would have loved. And the best part? None of it required Eric's approval. Not one form. Not one signature. Not one conversation. The property was mine. The decisions were mine. For the first time since Easter, that fact felt empowering rather than defensive. I kept everything private. No social media announcements. No family updates. No dramatic declarations. Just steady progress. Brick by brick. Month by month. And something unexpected happened. The anger started fading. Work became exciting again. My architecture firm landed several major projects. A sustainable housing development. A waterfront restoration project. A municipal design contract. My calendar filled up. My energy returned. I even got invited to speak at a regional architecture conference. Then another. An industry publication ran a feature on one of my coastal design projects. Old colleagues reached out. Former clients recommended me. Life started moving forward again. For so long I'd viewed being alone as evidence that something was missing. But somewhere along the way solitude stopped feeling like failure. It started feeling like freedom. Freedom from expectations. Freedom from guilt. Freedom from constantly trying to prove my worth. And that's exactly when Eric made his next move. Because apparently peace was something he couldn't allow. It happened on a Friday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a project proposal when my phone buzzed. Motion detected at front gate. I frowned. Nobody was supposed to be there. I opened the security app. The live feed appeared. And there he was, Eric, standing directly in front of the gate. Arms crossed, looking completely confident. Like he owned the place already. A folded document sat in one hand. His SUV was parked nearby. Melissa was sitting in the passenger seat. No kids. Just the two of them. Which immediately told me this wasn't a family visit. This was business. Or at least what Eric thought was business. I turned up the audio. He pressed the intercom button. Nathan. His voice echoed through the speaker. I know you're watching. I didn't respond. He pressed the button again. Nathan, come on. Still nothing. Then he held the document up toward the camera. This is a petition. I narrowed my eyes. A petition for shared ownership. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I kept listening. I spoke with an attorney. The confidence in his voice was unbelievable. If you don't want to cooperate voluntarily, we can handle this another way. There it was. The threat. The legal version of a toddler stomping his feet because someone told him no. He waved the paper again. We're prepared to take this to court. For several seconds I just stared at the screen. Not angry. Not scared. Just fascinated. Because for someone claiming to have consulted a lawyer, he seemed completely unaware of how badly this could backfire. Then Eric smiled. The exact same smile he'd worn at Easter brunch. The one that always appeared right before he made a terrible decision. And suddenly I had a feeling he was about to make his biggest mistake yet. Once a judge sees how you've been treating your family, Eric continued through the intercom, waving his paperwork around, they're going to start asking questions. I watched the video feed without saying a word. He sounded so confident. So certain. Like he'd already won. Hostile behavior. Emotional instability. Refusing reasonable access to family property. I almost laughed. Family property. The phrase again. The same phrase he'd been repeating for months. As if saying it enough times would magically make it true. What made the whole thing surreal was how little he actually knew. He didn't know about the conservation protections. He didn't know about the educational agreements. He didn't know about the secondary trust. And he definitely didn't know about the legal provisions that gave me complete authority over how the property would be used moving forward. In other words, he was threatening a lawsuit built entirely on assumptions. Dangerous assumptions. The kind that tend to collapse the moment real documentation enters the room. Eric pressed the intercom again. This isn't over. His voice carried across the speakers. You don't get to shut us out because you're angry. I said nothing. We're family, Nathan. Still nothing. Then came the line that made my decision for me. If you don't cooperate, I'll make sure the courts force you to. I stared at the screen for another second. Then I ended the feed. Not because I was intimidated. Because I was done listening. I picked up my phone. Called Margot. She answered on the second ring. Tell me. It's time. Pause. Then. Good. She didn't ask for clarification. She already knew exactly what I meant. The following Monday, I walked into her office feeling different. Lighter. Stronger. More certain. For months I'd been carrying guilt that wasn't mine. Responsibility that wasn't mine. Expectations that weren't mine. And somewhere along the way I'd mistaken endurance for peacekeeping. I kept trying to preserve relationships that other people were actively destroying. Not anymore. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reality. Reality backed by documents. Margot was already waiting when I arrived. A thick folder sat on her desk. She slid it toward me. Everything's finalized. I opened it. Inside were the completed preservation filings. County approvals. Environmental protections. Land use restrictions. Every signature exactly where it needed to be. Every legal vulnerability eliminated. I slowly turned the pages. Months of planning condensed into a stack of paperwork. How secure is it? Margot smiled. Extremely. Meaning? She leaned back. Meaning the property can no longer be converted into rental developments, split into ownership shares, or claimed through any argument involving future residential expansion. I looked up. So he can't touch it. Not legally. The answer felt satisfying. Not because I wanted Eric to lose. Because I wanted certainty. For the first time since Easter I had it. The attempted transfer paperwork actually helped us, she added. I raised an eyebrow. How? It established a pattern. That made sense. Every text. Every voicemail. Every pressure campaign. Every attempt to create ownership where none existed. All of it painted a picture. And that picture wasn't flattering. I closed the folder. Then I looked at her. I don't think a legal victory is enough. Her expression immediately sharpened. No. No. For months I'd been hearing rumors. Watching people distance themselves. Listening to relatives repeat things I'd never said. The story being told about me had become bigger than the property itself. I was tired of defending myself one conversation at a time. What are you thinking? I took a breath. I want the truth out. Margot smiled slowly. The kind of smile that appears when a chess player realizes their opponent just moved exactly where they hoped. Good, she said. Because I've been thinking the same thing. That was the beginning of the next phase. Not litigation. Documentation. We gathered everything. And I mean everything. Text messages. Voicemails. Emails. Screenshots. Witness statements. The failed power of attorney attempt. The real estate office records. The security footage from the gate. Months of interactions organized into a timeline. When we finished, the file was disturbingly comprehensive. Reading through it felt like watching someone else's life. Every manipulation became obvious when viewed together. Every lie connected to another lie. Every act of entitlement linked to a larger pattern. Looking at it all at once, I honestly wondered how I tolerated it for so long. Then came the second part of the plan. The audience. Because exposing the truth only works if the right people see it. I started with my Aunt Linda. She'd been one of the few relatives who still treated me like a human being throughout the entire ordeal. Not perfect. Not blindly supportive. Just fair. Which made her incredibly valuable. I called her one evening. Can I ask a favor? That depends. I smiled. Fair. What kind of favor? I want to organize a family dinner. Silence. Then. Oh no. It's not what you think. That sentence has never once been followed by good news. I laughed despite myself. Maybe not. Another pause. Is this about the cottage? Yes. More silence. Then. Are people going to start yelling? Not if everything goes according to plan. That is not reassuring. Will you host it? She sighed. A long, exhausted sigh. Then finally. Fine. I thanked her and hung up. The venue was set. Now I needed the final piece. Eric. I sent him a text. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just a simple message. Family dinner at Aunt Linda's next Saturday. I think it's time we clear the air. That was it. No threats. No details. No explanation. Within 5 minutes he replied. About time. I stared at the message, then smiled. Because I knew exactly how he'd interpret it. He thought I was backing down. He thought I'd finally accepted reality. He thought he was walking into a conversation where he'd get another chance to pressure me. What he didn't realize was that the conversation wasn't being arranged for his benefit. It was being arranged for everyone else's. And for the first time since Easter, I was looking forward to seeing my family. Because by the end of that dinner, nobody was going to be arguing about rumors anymore. They were going to be looking at evidence. He didn't respond immediately, but I knew he'd seen it. That little red receipt was enough. And honestly, that was all I needed. I could already picture him reacting, showing Hannah, ranting in the kitchen, walking back and forth like he was strategizing a war instead of panicking over a dinner invite. Good. Let him spiral. Let him overthink it. In the days before the dinner, I stayed busy on purpose. Not to distract myself. To prepare. I finalized everything with the nonprofit. Locked in the educational agreement for the cottage programs. Signed off on the last version of the coastal preservation plan. Updated my firm's website with a new sustainability project that indirectly referenced coastal restoration work. Carefully worded, nothing tied directly to the family situation. No names. No drama. Just facts. Quiet progress. I also made sure every document was backed up in at least 3 places. Contracts. Emails. Voicemails. Everything. Because at this point this wasn't just family conflict anymore. It was liability management. And Kyle still didn't realize the game had already changed. The day of the dinner I felt something unexpected. Not adrenaline. Not anger. A strange, steady clarity. The kind that comes when you stop trying to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Lisa's house looked warm from the outside. Soft lights in the windows. The smell of roasted rosemary drifting out before I even stepped in. She opened the door and hugged me immediately. No interrogation. No judgment. Just a quiet squeeze that said she already knew this wasn't going to be easy. They're all inside, she said softly. Pause. Just try to keep it civil. I let out a small breath. No promises. She gave me a tired smile. Figures. Inside the dining room was already full. My parents. Kyle. Hannah. No kids, thank God. My uncle Tim. My cousin Mark. Even a couple relatives I barely saw anymore. Nobody was relaxed. Nobody was comfortable. It wasn't a dinner. It was a waiting room before impact. Kyle sat at the far end of the table. Leaning back. Legs crossed. Performing confidence like it was still something he could claim. The moment I walked in he lifted his glass slightly. Nathan. His voice had that tone again. The one he used when he thought he was already winning. Glad you could make it. I didn't react. Just took my seat. I appreciate everyone coming, I said evenly. I wanted to clear the air. Pause. Then I added. But I also want to clarify a few things, legally and personally. That immediately shifted the room. My mother straightened. Nate, honey, I really think. I raised a hand slightly. Please. Just listen first. She stopped. Barely. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. Not the full archive. Just enough. A curated version. Clean. Focused. Controlled. These are records of multiple attempts by Kyle to claim ownership of my property. I slid a few pages forward. Including submitted fraudulent paperwork to a real estate agency. Hannah's expression tightened immediately. I also have a written statement from the agent involved. Kyle shifted in his chair. But still said nothing. Not yet. I kept going. There are also security records from the property showing unauthorized entry. A few heads turned toward him. And documented threats regarding legal action based on claims that I was mentally unstable and therefore unfit to manage the property. Lisa's eyes widened slightly. My father leaned forward just a little. Not interrupting. Just watching. Processing. The only sound in the room was the faint clink of someone setting down a fork they weren't using anyway. I exhaled once. Then finished the core point. And just to be clear, the cottage is no longer a simple family property. I tapped the folder. It's part of a legally protected preservation trust. Zone. Restricted. Enforced at the county level. My gaze shifted briefly to Kyle. And it cannot be transferred, divided, or claimed under any family-based argument. A beat of silence. Then Kyle finally laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he needed to break the tension. So that's it. He leaned forward. You dragged all of us here to give a legal presentation? His voice sharpened. To show off paperwork like you're some kind of genius? He shook his head. What's your endgame, Nate? Pause. Then he gestured vaguely around the table. Burn every bridge just to prove a point? I held his stare. The room tightened. Even my mother stopped breathing for a second. No, I said finally. My voice was steady. Calm. Almost too calm. I came here to make something clear. I slid the folder closed. The old dynamic is over. A beat. You don't get to guilt me into compliance anymore. Another beat. You don't get to rewrite reality just because it benefits you. I looked directly at him now. And you definitely don't get to take things that were never yours. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Like the entire room had just realized something irreversible had already happened. And nobody, not even Kyle, was in control of it anymore. You've spent years hiding behind the fact that you're a father, I said. Like it automatically makes you right. The room went still. Being a parent doesn't give you a free pass to treat people badly. My mother looked genuinely shocked. Nathan. No. I turned toward her. For once, let me finish. She fell silent. You keep saying he's my brother. I nodded toward Eric. But I'm your son too. The words came out calmer than I expected. Somewhere along the way I stopped feeling like family and started feeling like a backup plan. Mom's face tightened. A backup plan? Yeah. I laughed bitterly. The person everyone called when Eric needed money. The person everyone expected to compromise. The person who was supposed to understand. I shook my head. Every single time. She looked away. Good. For once I wanted her to hear it. Really hear it. I reached into my folder one final time. Then placed the document in the center of the table. This is the Educational Partnership Agreement. Several people leaned forward. Beginning this summer, the cottage will host environmental education programs and marine science workshops. I looked around the room. It'll be used exactly the way Grandpa would have wanted. Then I glanced at Eric. And before anyone asks, no, there won't be room for family vacation requests anymore. The reaction was immediate. Eric shoved his chair backward. The legs scraped loudly against the floor. You've lost your mind. Maybe. I shrugged. But at least I'm done letting you walk all over me. For a second I thought he might explode. The same way he had at Easter. The same look flashed across his face. Anger. Embarrassment. Panic. The difference this time was the audience. Too many witnesses. Too many facts. Too much evidence. There was nothing left for him to manipulate. Nothing left to twist. My father finally spoke. Quietly. I warned you. Everyone turned toward him. Including Eric. What? Dad met his gaze. I warned you. His voice never rose. You pushed too far. Eric stared at him. You're taking his side? No. Dad shook his head. I'm taking the side of reality. The silence afterward was deafening. A moment later Eric stood. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed him. He walked straight to the door. Opened it. And left. No dramatic speech. No final insult. Just the sound of a door slamming somewhere down the hallway. Then nothing. The strange thing was that I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. Like a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally slipped off my shoulders. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end. Not even close. Because while Eric thought he'd just lost a family argument, he still had no idea what he'd triggered legally. The attempted transfer. The forged documents. The false claims. All of it had consequences. Consequences that were already moving through the system. And about a week later those consequences arrived. In the form of a subpoena. I wasn't there when he received it. But based on the flood of messages that hit my phone afterward, I could make a pretty good guess. The first texts arrived less than an hour later. What is this? Are you serious right now? You're actually doing this? Then came the predictable one. We're family, Nate. I stared at that message for several seconds. The irony was almost impressive. Family mattered when he needed something. Not when I did. I didn't respond. More messages arrived. Longer ones. Angrier ones. Then finally, one text that told me everything I needed to know. What do you want? A minute later. How much will it take to make this disappear? There it was. No denial. No apology. No explanation. Just negotiation. Eric's favorite language. If guilt didn't work, he tried leverage. If leverage didn't work, he tried money. But this wasn't about money anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. What I wanted was accountability. And maybe, if I was being honest, closure. To be clear, the subpoena wasn't some dramatic courtroom spectacle. I wasn't trying to ruin his life. I wasn't chasing damages. I wasn't looking for a jury trial. What I wanted was documentation. A permanent record. A formal acknowledgement of what had happened. Margot filed a civil complaint outlining the attempted property fraud and identity misrepresentation. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing emotional. Just facts. The real estate records. The forged paperwork. The witness statement. The security footage. The timeline. All of it. The filing triggered a formal mediation process and required Eric to respond. That was enough. Because now everything existed on the record. And records are harder to manipulate than family gossip. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During those 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. My life kept moving forward. I ran along the coastline in the mornings. Worked on renovation plans for the educational programs. Met with conservation groups. Focused on clients. Focused on projects. Focused on things that actually mattered. One evening, after speaking at an architecture event, someone approached me with an idea. A small publishing project. A collection of essays about sustainable design, preservation, and legacy. Normally I would have laughed it off. But this time I paused. Then I thought about Grandpa. About everything he'd built. Everything he'd left behind. Not just property. Values. Perspective. Purpose. And for the first time I said yes. The family situation meanwhile grew quieter. Almost strangely quiet. Then my mother left a voicemail. I listened to it twice. Her voice sounded different. Smaller. I don't understand what's happening anymore. A long pause. I just want things to go back to normal. I sat there for a while after listening. Then deleted the message. Because there was no normal left to return to. Not the old version. Not the version where I apologized for having boundaries. Not the version where I absorbed every problem and called it family. That version of me was gone. And honestly, I didn't miss him. The morning of the mediation hearing arrived faster than expected. I wore a charcoal blazer, dark jeans, and a simple button-down. Professional. Comfortable. Nothing flashy. When I entered the county building, I spotted Eric almost immediately. He'd chosen a different strategy. Full suit. Perfect tie. Polished shoes. Hair slicked back so aggressively it looked uncomfortable. He looked less like someone attending mediation and more like someone running for public office. Melissa stood beside him. Designer handbag. Oversized sunglasses. The kind of expression people wear when they're trying very hard to look unbothered. For a moment our eyes met across the hallway. Neither of us spoke. But for the first time since this whole mess began, I noticed something different. Eric looked nervous. And that told me everything I needed to know. Margot met me in the lobby outside the mediation room. "You ready?" she asked. I adjusted my jacket. "More than ready." She nodded once. "Good." Then we walked inside. The room looked exactly how every government conference room looks. Neutral walls. Fluorescent lighting. A long oval table. No personality whatsoever. At the head sat the mediator. A woman in her 50s with a clipboard and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades watching families destroy themselves over money. Introductions were made. Procedures were explained. Attendance was confirmed. Then the evidence started. Margot handled everything. Methodically. Professionally. Chronologically. The forged paperwork. The testimony from the real estate office. The security footage. The audio recordings. The trust documents. The zoning protections. Every piece of evidence built on the last one. Brick by brick. Fact by fact. Across the table, Eric grew quieter with each passing minute. Melissa stopped taking notes entirely. The confidence they'd carried into the building was disappearing fast. Because for the first time they couldn't control the narrative. The truth was sitting in front of everyone. Documented. Verified. Impossible to argue with. Eventually the mediator turned toward Eric. "Would you like to respond?" He cleared his throat. Tried to sit straighter. Tried to sound reasonable. "This has all been a misunderstanding." Nobody reacted. "I was only trying to protect family property." The mediator made a note. "Family property?" "Yes." He nodded quickly. "My brother has been acting emotionally lately." There it was. The same argument again. The same script. The mediator looked up. "Emotionally?" Eric hesitated. "Well, concerned." "We were concerned." "Concerned enough to submit paperwork on his behalf?" Silence. The mediator folded her hands. "Mr. Carter, were you ever granted legal authority over the property?" A long pause. "No." "Did your brother ever authorize you to act on his behalf?" "No." "Did you have any legal documentation granting you those rights?" Another pause. "No." The mediator wrote something down. "Thank you." And that was basically the end of it. Everything afterward felt procedural. The findings were straightforward. No criminal charges. Not at this time. But the civil complaint would remain on record. Future attempts to access, transfer, represent, or claim ownership of the property could trigger additional legal consequences, including fraud investigations, restraining orders, financial penalties. Officially it was a warning. Unofficially it was a permanent paper trail. Exactly what I'd wanted. When the hearing ended, people began gathering their things. Chairs slid back. Folders closed. Pens disappeared into briefcases. Then Eric made one final attempt. As we walked toward the door, he stepped beside me. Close enough that only I could hear him. "You think this makes you better than me?" I didn't answer. "You'll still end up alone." His voice dropped lower. "Just like you've always been." For a second I studied him. Really studied him. The anger. The bitterness. The desperation. And suddenly I realized something. He genuinely believed that being alone was the worst thing that could happen to a person. Because he couldn't imagine finding value anywhere except through other people's approval. I smiled. Not smugly. Not cruelly. Just honestly. I'd rather be alone with my integrity than surrounded by people who only show up when they want something. He blinked. For once he had no response. Then I walked away. And that was the last meaningful conversation we ever had. The fallout came quickly. Faster than I expected. Small towns have long memories. Especially coastal towns. People talk. Stories travel. And once the details became public, the narrative changed. The version of events Eric had been selling for months started falling apart. People asked questions. The answers weren't flattering. He didn't lose his job. His father-in-law owned the company, so that was never likely. But he did lose something else. Trust. Several clients quietly left. A few community organizations stopped working with him. One former client even reached out to me directly. Not for information. Just to say they weren't comfortable doing business with someone who had tried to manipulate property records involving family. For the first time in his life, consequences stuck. My mother changed too. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But noticeably. She stopped defending him. Stopped making excuses. Stopped calling me to negotiate peace treaties. Mostly she went quiet. A different kind of quiet. The kind people fall into when they're forced to confront something they've avoided for years. Then about 2 weeks after the hearing, a package arrived at my apartment. Inside was an old photo album. One I hadn't seen since I was a kid. I sat on the floor and flipped through it. Fishing trips. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. Pictures of Grandpa teaching me how to use tools. Pictures of us standing on the porch of the cottage. Memories I'd forgotten existed. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note. Nathan, I don't know if I ever truly saw what was happening. I don't know when protecting one child became overlooking another. But I see it now, and I'm sorry. I hope someday you'll give me the chance to make things right. Love, Mom. I read it 3 times. Then closed the album. I never responded. Not because I hated her. Because I honestly didn't know what to say. Some wounds heal. Some don't. And some simply become part of who you are. Still, I kept the album. That summer the cottage changed. Not physically. Purposefully. For the first time in years, it felt alive again. Students arrived for environmental workshops. Volunteers planted dune grass along the shoreline. Researchers monitored erosion patterns. Children explored tide pools and learned about marine ecosystems. Every week brought new faces, new stories, new energy. I partnered with a marine biology professor from a nearby university. The educational programs expanded. The conservation work grew. And eventually a small workshop building was added behind the cottage. The students voted to name it. They called it the Carter Learning Retreat. When they invited me to speak at the dedication ceremony, I almost declined. Then I remembered Grandpa, so I said yes. My speech lasted less than 3 minutes. I looked out at the crowd, at the students, at the volunteers, at the shoreline beyond them, and I said, this place was built by people who believe that what we leave behind matters. I paused. It survived storms. It survived mistakes. It survived people trying to use it for the wrong reasons. A few people smiled. And now it gets to give something back. That was all. I never mentioned Eric. I never mentioned the lawsuit. I never mentioned the family drama. Because by then none of it mattered. The greatest victory wasn't winning. It wasn't proving I was right. It wasn't watching someone face consequences. It was finding purpose beyond the conflict. Months later, I stood alone on the porch as the sun disappeared beyond the water. The same porch where this entire journey had really begun. The waves rolled in. The wind moved through the dunes. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Looking back, I realized something unexpected. My family hadn't taken anything from me. If anything, they forced me to see myself clearly. My boundaries. My values. My worth. The person I'd spent years minimizing just to keep everyone else comfortable. Maybe I could have handled some things differently. Maybe I held on to my anger longer than I should have. Maybe there were moments when pride influenced my decisions more than I'd like to admit. But one thing I know for certain is this. I stopped allowing people to decide what I deserved. And I don't think I'll ever go back. So, AIA for refusing to give my brother my grandfather's beach house and taking legal action after he tried to claim it as his own?